July 5, 1943. Over the wheat fields of Kursk, the earth trembles. More than 3,000 German tanks surge forward in the largest armored assault the world has ever seen. But before their engines roar, the Soviets strike first. At 2:20 a.m., the Red Army unleashes a massive artillery barrage. Shells rain down on German assembly areas, cutting wires, disabling tanks, scattering infantry. The German timetable is shattered. Operation Citadel, the Wehrmacht's last great offensive on the Eastern Front, has begun under fire. But this is no ordinary battle. Kursk is where Hitler gambled everything to regain initiative. It's where Stalin prepared a fortress of steel and soil with 5 defensive belts and over 1 million Soviet soldiers waiting. This wasn't just a battle, it was the moment the tide of World War II turned. But how did we get here? To understand Kursk, we must go back to the ashes of World War I. In the autumn of 1918, the guns of Europe finally fell silent. After 4 years of trench warfare and mass slaughter, Germany lay exhausted. But its armies had not been driven across the Rhine, nor had Berlin fallen. Instead, the nation collapsed from within, politically, economically, and spiritually. When the Kaiser abdicated and the Weimar Republic was proclaimed, it was not victory that awaited, it was humiliation. Less than a year later, the victors gathered at Versailles. Under the chandeliers of the Hall of Mirrors, they imposed a peace not designed to reconcile, but to punish. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, stripped of its colonies, its navy, and vast territories. It was ordered to pay reparations so crippling they would take generations to repay. But the most lasting wound was psychological. The Treaty of Versailles was not only a loss of land and treasure, it was a loss of honor. In Berlin, the consequences were immediate. The new democratic government was born under siege. Soldiers returned to chaos, finding inflation destroying their savings and radicals fighting in the streets. By 1923, money had become worthless, banknotes were burned for fuel, bread cost billions, the middle class disintegrated, the Republic's promises rang hollow, and into that void, extremism crept in. It was in this atmosphere that Adolf Hitler, a failed artist and wounded veteran, began to speak. His words, bitter and direct, blamed Jews, communists, and above all the Treaty of Versailles for Germany's fall. After a failed coup and a short prison sentence, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, a manifesto of hatred and ambition that would define the next 2 decades. And yet, for a brief moment, Germany stabilized. American loans propped up the economy. Cities hummed again. But it was an illusion. When the global financial system crashed in 1929, Germany fell harder than anyone. Factories closed, unemployment soared, starvation returned, and so did Hitler, now backed by millions. By 1933, he was chancellor. By 1934, dictator. And from the start, he vowed to destroy the peace imposed at Versailles. In public, he offered order and revival. In private, he plotted expansion and war.
Du, meine Arbeit für richtig hältst, ob du glaubst, dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich gearbeitet habe, dass ich mich in diesen Jahren für dich eingesetzt habe, dass ich anständig meine Zeit verwendet habe im Dienste meines Volkes. Gib du jetzt deine Stimme ab. Wenn ja, dann tritt für mich ein, so wie ich für dich eingetreten bin.
The treaty had been written to prevent another global catastrophe. Instead, it had created the perfect conditions for one. Versailles was meant to end war. Instead, it gave birth to vengeance. As the 1920s ended, the world did not grow safer. It grew angrier. In Italy, the liberal government had crumbled under pressure. The First World War had promised victory but delivered little. Chaos reigned in the streets. Strikes, riots, and fear. In October 1922, a former soldier and newspaper editor named Benito Mussolini marched on Rome at the head of a black-shirted militia. The king refused to stop him. Within days, Mussolini was appointed prime minister. Democracy died in silence. Fascism had arrived, and it offered something that broken nations craved: discipline, unity, and the illusion of strength. Across the Adriatic, a different empire was rising. Japan, though victorious in World War I, faced its own crisis. Its population was surging, its industrial needs were outgrowing its islands, and it had no oil, no iron, no coal of its own. The military, still answering to the emperor, saw one answer: expansion. In 1931, without civilian approval, the Japanese forces staged an incident and invaded Manchuria, a resource-rich region in northern China. The League of Nations condemned the action. Japan simply walked out of the League. The world did nothing. Emboldened, the Japanese turned their sights toward China's heart. In Germany, the consequences of Versailles and the Great Depression had collided. By 1932, 6 million Germans were out of work. Starvation returned. The democratic system, already fragile, collapsed into paralysis. And amid the wreckage stood Adolf Hitler. His Nazi party promised rebirth, jobs, unity, and revenge. Behind his speeches was a clear agenda: total power. In January 1933, President Hindenburg appointed him chancellor. It was meant to contain him. It did the opposite. Within weeks, the Reichstag burned. Hitler blamed the communists, declared a state of emergency, and seized emergency powers. Civil liberties were suspended. Political opponents were arrested. By August 1934, after Hindenburg's death, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself the Führer. Germany was now a dictatorship. What followed was rapid and ruthless. The economy was rearmed under the guise of public works. Highways were built, factories retooled, conscription reintroduced. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had been forbidden to build an air force. Hitler unveiled the Luftwaffe in 1935 to 1,500 aircraft ready for war. The Nazi regime's ideology was clear: racial purity at home, expansion abroad. The Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of citizenship and banned intermarriage with Aryans. The first concentration camps opened. Fear became law. The masses cheered. And as Hitler rose, so did alliances. In 1936, Germany and Italy joined in an anti-Comintern pact with Japan. Presented as a defense against communism, in truth, it was the foundation of a global axis. 3 regimes, fascist, imperialist, and Nazi, bound together by power, ambition, and contempt for peace. The League of Nations, created to ensure security through diplomacy, watched it all in paralysis. When Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in 1935, The League condemned him. He ignored it. When Japan attacked China in 1937, cities burned, civilians were massacred in Nanjing. The totalitarian states had tested the waters. There were no consequences. Now they would plunge the world into war. By the end of the 1930s, Europe stood on the edge once more, and Hitler was no longer hiding his ambitions. In March 1938, he made his first major move. German troops crossed the border into Austria in what became known as the Anschluss. It was not an invasion. There were no shots fired. Austrians welcomed the Wehrmacht with open arms. Within days, Austria ceased to exist as a sovereign nation. Germany had expanded. Challenged, the response from Britain and France was silence. 6 months later, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia. In the border region known as the Sudetenland, a large ethnic German population gave him his pretext. He demanded it be handed over. The Czech government refused. Its army was strong, its defenses modern, and it was ready to fight. But the war would never come. In September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich. There, with Mussolini as mediator, he agreed to Hitler's demands, without Czech representation. The Sudetenland was ceded to Germany. Chamberlain returned home waving the agreement, declaring, "Peace for our time." Within 6 months, Hitler took the rest of Czechoslovakia. There were no more German minorities to defend. This was pure conquest. Now Hitler looked east to Poland. He demanded the return of Danzig and a corridor to link East Prussia with the rest of Germany. But this time, Britain and France drew a line. They issued a guarantee to the Polish state. If Germany attacked, they would go to war. But Hitler had already neutralized the greatest threat to his eastern ambitions. On August 23, 1939, the world was stunned as Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after their foreign ministers, included a secret protocol. Germany would take western Poland. The Soviets would take the east, along with the Baltic states and parts of Romania. Hitler would not face a war on two fronts. At least, not yet. At dawn on September 1, 1939, German troops crossed the Polish frontier. The Blitzkrieg had begun. Waves of tanks, dive bombers, and motorized infantry swept through Polish defenses. Within hours, Polish airfields were destroyed. Within days, their command structures shattered. 2 days later, on September 3, Britain and France declared war on Germany. But their armies stood still. There were no attacks, no invasions, just words. In Warsaw, the Polish army fought on alone. Then came the final blow. On September 17, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. Caught in a pincer, the Polish state collapsed. By the end of the month, Poland was gone, carved up between two totalitarian powers. It had taken just 28 days. For Hitler, it was a triumph. For Stalin, a cold calculation. For the West, a realization too late that appeasement had failed. The Second World War had begun, but the storm was only starting to spread. The pincer movement from both north and south, surrounding and destroying Red Army forces within. The Germans committed nearly 1 million men, over 2,700 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft to the attack. making it one of the largest operations in the war. But this time the element of surprise was gone. Soviet intelligence, aided by spy networks and captured prisoners, had learned of the plan weeks in advance. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and the Soviet High Command made a calculated decision. They would not strike first. Instead, they would fortify, absorb the German assault, and then counterattack. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers and more than 3,000 tanks were positioned in layered defensive belts, minefields, trenches, anti-tank ditches, and artillery zones stretched for hundreds of miles. Kursk was transformed into one of the most heavily fortified positions in military history. On July 5, 1943, before dawn, the Red Army opened with a massive preemptive artillery barrage targeting German staging areas. Despite this, the Germans advanced. In the north, General Model's 9th Army pushed toward the town of Ponyri, where they encountered fierce resistance. In the south, General Hoth's 4th Panzer Army made deeper gains, threatening the Soviet lines near Prohorovka. It was there, on July 12th, that the battle reached its brutal climax. At dawn, 900 Soviet T-34 tanks stormed the open fields outside Prokhorovka, charging headlong into advancing German armor, including the feared Tiger tanks. What followed was the largest tank engagement of the war, fought at close quarters in a chaotic, dust-choked battlefield. With little room for maneuver, tanks collided at point-blank range. Crews fired blindly through smoke. Some vehicles resorted to ramming. Above, over 1,000 aircraft from both sides clashed in the skies. Neither side gained a decisive edge, but the Soviet lines held. German losses were severe, and their momentum stalled. Meanwhile, news reached Hitler that Allied forces had invaded Sicily. With pressure mounting in the west, he ordered the offensive at Kursk to be halted. Operation Citadel, meant to regain the initiative in the east, had failed. The Red Army, battered but unbroken, launched its own counteroffensives within days. Soviet forces pushed westward, liberating Orel, Belgorod, and Kharkov in rapid succession. The strategic outcome was clear. Kursk marked the last time Germany would mount a major offensive on the Eastern Front. From this point forward, the Red Army would dictate the pace of the war. The Wehrmacht had not only lost thousands of tanks and irreplaceable troops, it had lost the initiative, perhaps permanently. For the Soviets, Kursk proved that they could withstand the full weight of the German military and strike back with overwhelming force. It was a turning point not just in the East, but in the entire trajectory of World War II. The Battle of Kursk did more than stop a German offensive. It shattered the illusion that the Wehrmacht could ever regain dominance in the east. From this point forward, it was the Red Army that advanced across Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic, and into the heart of Europe. German forces, stretched thin and weakened by mounting losses, would never again launch a major operation on Soviet soil. But Kursk was not an isolated event. It was the consequence of 2 decades of unresolved tensions, economic collapse, and rising authoritarianism. The seeds had been planted at Versailles, in a treaty that punished rather than healed, and in a world order that failed to stand when aggression first stirred in the 1930s. The road to Kursk was long, and had passed through Munich, Manchuria, Ethiopia, Poland. For Hitler, Kursk marked the beginning of the end. For Stalin, it was vindication. For the millions caught between them, it was another chapter in a war that had already taken everything. World War II would rage for nearly 2 more years. The fighting would stretch into the streets of Berlin, and the ashes of cities would become the new foundation for peace. But what happened at Kursk proved one thing: the tide could turn, even against the most formidable of war machines, when strategy, preparation, and sacrifice aligned. It is easy to study battles. It is harder to understand what leads to them. So we ask the question: how many lives could have been saved if the world had acted sooner? How different might history have been if justice had been tempered with wisdom in 1919? If you believe that history must not repeat itself, if you believe that remembering matters, then carry this story forward. Share it, subscribe, and remember, the war is over, but its lessons must never be forgotten.